So I'd love to tell you a little bit about my family. You see, we are a pretty big family, and not just that, we're extremely blended. You see, both my parents had first marriages, and they had children in both of those marriages, and then they got divorced, got together, and then they had me. So I'm really the only child, if you will, with my parents. But on my dad's side, I have three half brothers. And then on my mom's side, I have a half brother, a half sister, and then I have two cousins that my mom took guardianship over early on in their life because one of their parents died and the other wasn't capable of taking care of them at the time. So I grew up with my mom's kids, so it was me plus a brother, sister, and two cousins, a boy and a girl, and they're all older than me. And so as everyone grew up, my older siblings got married, and some had children, and my sister wasn't able to have children because she has an autoimmune disease called lupus, and it was dangerous for her. And so my sister and her husband, they had the honor and the privilege of adopting two wonderful children. Their names are Brooklyn and Cameron. So Cameron's a little bit older than Brooklyn. I think Cameron's around 10 right now. Or no, Brooklyn's around 10. Cameron might be... Oh, no, I'm getting their ages wrong. I'm sorry. I'm a terrible uncle. I don't know their ages. They're old, like 8, 9, 10, around there. And you see, Cameron and Brooklyn are black. And my sister... while she is Hispanic, she looks very white, and her husband is white. And so they have this unique family. And then my sister ended up having a child, and so her name is Kennedy. So they're a family of 5, and they are very much blended themselves. And you see, growing up in Kingsburg, I love this town, but growing up in Kingsburg, you don't see very many people of color. There's a lot of white people, and then there's a lot of Hispanic people, and a very small percentage of everything else in between. And so for Cameron and Brooklyn, growing up in Kingsburg has been interesting because they don't see a lot of people who are necessarily like them. And since we, growing up in Kingsburg, since we don't experience and have experiences with people of color very often, sometimes we say things and we do things that are not very respectable. And so one time my nephew Cameron was in class, and there was a substitute teacher at the time, and this substitute teacher, I know they didn't mean anything by it, but they asked another student to get Cameron's attention. And Cameron was doing something, he was focused, and so she couldn't get his attention, and so she asked another kid, get his attention, and the student asked, well, whose attention do you want? And she said, the black boy, get the black boy's attention. I think in that moment she realized what she had said, and at the surface level it doesn't really seem all that bad, right? But imagine if it was me in his shoes, and she said, get the Mexican boy's attention. Or flip it, and it was like, get that white boy's attention. Like, the moment you attribute who someone is to like their skin color or their ability or their sex or something like that, it has a different tone to it, right? And you see, Cameron and Brooklyn growing up in Kingsburg, they're going to have different experiences like that, and they've been experiencing things like that. You see, I wouldn't classify that as a direct intentional injustice toward Cameron, but it was an unintentional injustice towards him, right? And injustice is something that's a little real with my family now. It's something that we experience. And you see, here at Community Youth, we've been talking about injustice starting last week, right? And we've defined injustice as the things in our world that aren't right. They're not fair, and maybe they're not equal. And it's painful to experience injustice, and it makes us all ask the question, why doesn't somebody do something? You see, it's even worse when injustice is ongoing, or if it's systemic, or if it's constant. And last week we talked about how God sees and God cares about what's happening. You see, God is anti-injustice, right? God is for justice. And part of following Jesus means that we care about the things He cares about, enough to do something. And maybe you hear that and you think, that's great, but what about me? If you've been the victim of injustices like racism or oppression or discrimination or abuse or prejudice, then you know what that feels like. And if you felt that way, you may be showing up each week and wondering, how do I handle this when it's happening to me and not just around me? Or maybe others of you are thinking, that's not me. Like, that's not my story. And I get that. Like, trust me, I get that too. But as a family, because here at Community Youth, we are family. And so when one of us suffers, we all suffer. And this is a good opportunity for you to hear what injustice feels like to one of your family members that is experiencing it. And that's why I want to challenge you to lean in and practice what we talked about in our first week, to be curious. So if you're experiencing injustice or you have experienced injustice, what do you do? What do you do when you feel like you are alone in that? When was the first time injustice felt personal to you, whether it affected you, your family, or a friend? What do you do when you feel like you are alone in dealing with injustice? Who is someone you can talk to or ask for help when you or a friend is hurt by injustice? With that in mind, I want to tell you a true story about 3 friends and what happened to them. You see, there was a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar who was very powerful. And he had conquered and captured Israel. And one day he built this giant statue. It was a giant golden statue, and it stood like 90 feet tall. And he ordered everyone to bow down to worship that statue once they heard like a certain music playing. And if they chose not to do as they were ordered, they would be thrown into a blazing fire. And the Bible tells us that there were 3 Jewish men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who were worshipers of God, worshipers of Yahweh, and refused to bow down and worship that statue. And you could probably guess that the king was not thrilled with this news, and he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought to him. And he gave them one more opportunity, one more chance to bow down and worship the statue when the music played, or they would be thrown into the fire. But these 3 men stood their ground. They believed that God could rescue them, but even if He didn't, they didn't want to turn from their devotion to Him. What an incredible example of courage and faith. So, of course, the king he's in full rage mode now and orders the fire to be burned 7 times hotter than it was originally going. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're tied up. Like the ropes are tied around them, they're bound, and then they're thrown into the fire. Now get this, the furnace was so hot that the soldiers who were throwing the 3 men into the fire, they died simply from being so close to the fire. The flames just consumed them. It was so hot. Now look, I get none of us have been thrown into fires, right? But I think we can agree that this feels unfair. And many of us do know what it feels like to be treated unfairly, to be discriminated against for our skin color, to be treated like we're less than because of our family's finances, to be held back because of our sex, to be considered less important because of something we have absolutely no control over. And if you've experienced this, you know it can be scary, right? Like you know it can be frustrating and it can be sad. And these guys, I'm sure they felt all of that. Well, let's continue in the story. I want to see what happens next after they were in the fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Now, there are many Bible scholars and researchers who have opinions about this story and who that 4th man in the fire was. Was he God? Was he Jesus? Was it an angel or someone else? And look, I don't know the answer, but one thing is clear. In a moment of extreme injustice, they were not alone. God did not abandon them. God did not leave them to suffer on their own. And in the same way, you are never alone when you face injustice. Like, let that sink in for a second. When you experience injustice, you don't have to face it alone. You see, God cared about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and made sure they weren't alone in their suffering. He made sure they weren't alone in their injustice. Did things change? Well, yeah, eventually. Did the laws change as a result of that injustice? Yeah. But don't miss what happened even while they were suffering. You see, God cared for them. And in the same way, God cares for you and doesn't want you to be alone when you face injustice. Name a time when someone came alongside you during a difficult time in your life. How did it affect the way you handled or processed the situation? So maybe you hear this story and you feel the injustice part. Maybe you are so tired, so hurt, or so burned by things you've experienced that you don't know where to turn. Now, I want you to know that you don't have to be alone. God is with you. God hears you. If you're processing that for the first time, or you just don't know what to do next, here are some steps for you to consider. Talk to Jesus. Talk to him. He cares, maybe even more than you realize. Share your feelings of frustration, of confusion, of hurt. Remind yourself over and over that you are not alone. Remember that he will send others to be with you. Talk to your community group leader or talk to a trusted friend or adult. Even if you think they won't understand, keep talking until someone does. And consider talking to your family about getting help from a professional counselor or a mentor who can help you process the injustice you experienced and begin to heal. And keep moving. You see, the guys in the fire didn't give up. And let's be honest, you shouldn't have to do anything about the injustice that is affecting you. Others should step up. Generations older than you should have figured this out by now. It's unfair. All that is true, but at the same time, doing nothing isn't always helpful. So keep moving. Some of you, however, may have heard that story and thought, I haven't really experienced injustice. Does that mean I'm like the evil king who caused the injustice? I don't know, maybe not. Or perhaps it makes you like the people in the crowd who stood and watched while all this was happening. We all participate in injustice in some way, like often by allowing it to happen while we watch. Maybe you didn't throw someone in the fire, but maybe you laughed along when you heard a racist joke. Or maybe you watch people get bullied instead of like saying anything. Or maybe you listen to music that's degrading to women. Look, if that's you, I want you to know that you can talk to God about that. You can. In Psalm 139, the writer opens up and he asks God the most beautiful question. See if there is any offensive way in me. Start there. Ask God to help you see ways that you've participated in injustice. You see, this is so important because the truth is some of the people you care about most, your friends from school, your community group, have been on the receiving end of injustice. And maybe for the first time you see it differently and you care differently because of how it affects them. Let it become personal to you. Why is it important to believe someone when they say they have been hurt by injustice, even if you don't understand how they feel? How can this group support each other when we experience injustice? How can your student ministry be a more welcoming place for people experiencing injustice? Why does it matter how Jesus followers respond when their friends or classmates or teammates experience injustice? When injustice happens, it's painful, but you don't have to do something alone. Not only is God with you, but so are the people in your community group. That's why we have community groups. That's why we have these groups. We want you to have a group of people who are for you. We want you to have a group of people who are listening to you, who are praying with you, who are learning from you and cheering for you. In your community groups, the conversations you have today, they have the potential to be one of the most honest, personal, and important discussions you've ever had. If you've experienced injustice, think about how you can let the group know that you need support. If you haven't experienced injustice, think about how you can listen and genuinely care for someone in your group. Now, this may sound like a lot right now. I get it. Even if you don't talk to your whole group, I want to encourage you to at least talk to your community group leader, because this is what they signed up for, okay? They want to be here for you, and they can be a real human reminder that when you experience injustice, that you do not have to face it alone. Thanks for hanging out again. I just want to put something on your radar really quick. Remember, this upcoming Sunday, so March 14th, we're having a prayer and worship night. I want to encourage you to come out. It's going to be a great time of doing just that. We're going to be praying together. We're going to be worshiping God together, and it's meant to be a spiritual experience. And so if that sounds like something you want to participate in, please come. And if you want to invite some friends, do so. We're going to be inviting people from other youth ministries as well. So if you have friends who go to other churches, invite them. That's great. And lastly, I want to encourage you to continue praying for Antonio as he heals. So please lift him up in your prayers in your community group as well as outside of your community group. And finally, before your group ends, I want to encourage you to share the good things God's doing in your life. Lift up the difficult things that you need His help with. And then also to be praying for your oikos. So if you need a new oikos card, talk to your community group leader and we'll get you a new one, okay? Thanks for hanging out. We'll see you next week.